Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Decentralized Energy Panel. We have very interesting panelists representing leading organizations in the space. There's Radhika Thakkar, Vice President, Greenlight Planet, Jagjeet Sareen, Director of the International Solar Alliance, Ashvin Dayal, Senior Vice President of Power, Rockefeller Foundation, and Hendrik Engelmann-Pilger. I really hope I haven't mangled your name, from the European Investment Bank. The moderator for this session is Arunabha Ghosh, the founder and CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Arunabha, over to you.
Thank you, Nirgish, and good evening, everyone. I hope you all have been enjoying the engaging sessions in this two-day virtual conference. Lockdown as we are, it's hard to know, when is it morning, afternoon, evening. I just feel I'm always in front of a screen, but I also look forward to engaging conversations that actually would have taken a much longer time to actually get people together and put things together. So there is an upside to be able to do these things quickly and get a range of voices together. In this section, we are going to be discussing distributed energy. And, for those of you who don't know me, I run the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. And one of the things that is very dear to our hearts is the future of the energy system, particularly the electricity system. And since 2012, when we first started looking very closely at distributed energy, we saw that there's been a huge change in the way the sector was perceived then versus what the opportunities are now. For instance, if I just reflect on the past, distributed energy was considered to be only something that was used to fill a gap that the centralized energy system could not. That it was meant to be always small scale, both in terms of the deal sizes, but also the number of systems installed and so forth, compared to the larger energy system. And it was considered to be something that only targeted the bottom of the pyramid, the energy poor, those excluded from the energy system. What has changed in the last decade? Of course, a lot of those earlier propositions still hold true. There are still a lot of poor people who remain outside of the energy net, even though a wire might have been strung across to their homes, or that they might have got access to an LPG cylinder for clean cooking. Nevertheless, they still tend to get served by a range of distributed energy systems. But more than that, we see a huge uptick in what could be called community energy, energy that is used for primary schools in rural areas, primary health centers. Just one state in India, Chhattisgarh, installed more than 1,000 primary health centers with distributed solar. I, in fact, won an award on the basis of that program, which also had an impact on the footfalls in these primary health centers, the improvement in health metrics. Given that we are talking about improving and strengthening our health systems, what might be the role of distributed energy there? We also see now an increasing focus on distributed energy on the productive energy side. What kind of applications of distributed energy could be used in agriculture? India has already deployed more solar-based irrigation pumps than any other country in the world, and has a plan to deploy a total of 2.7 million solar-based irrigation pumps to try and replace or displace the diesel or fossil-based electricity pumps. But even outside of agriculture, there are opportunities. My colleagues have found that there is a $50 billion opportunity in using distributed energy with efficient motors for income-generating activities in rural areas. Equally, one more change that has happened is that we are thinking more and more about distributed energy in the urban setting. The role of rooftop photovoltaic systems is no longer just something that you see on an episodic basis, a neighbor here or a colony there, but something that distribution companies are thinking very seriously about. So what might the future of distributed energy then look like? Will we have these systems be more interactive with grids? Will we be opening up completely new sectors, district heating and cooling, using distributed energy? Does distributed energy have a role in the electric mobility transition? So I think just less than a decade, we have moved from something that was completely marginal to something that could become very much mainstream. And yet, the big question for me is what has held back our imaginations. So we have a stellar panel here as they were introduced. I'm going to just reintroduce them once again. We've got Ashvin Dayal, Senior Vice President for Power at the Rockefeller Foundation, Radhika Thakkar, Vice President of the Greenlight Planet, Jagjeet Sareen, Director of the International Solar Alliance, and Hendrik Engelmann-Pilger, Senior Energy Specialist at the European Investment Bank. I'm going to get started with asking each of our panelists to offer their initial remarks on this, but also keep in mind my opening question: what is holding back our imaginations? Maybe I'll start with Radhika.
Sure, thank you so much. Really interesting opening there, by the way. Let me spend just a minute explaining Greenlight Planet, what we do. So we make a range of solar home lighting solutions for households that are historically, particularly in India, entirely off the grid, increasingly for households and businesses that are grid connected, but with unpredictable, unreliable access to energy. So typically rural households, low income households who don't necessarily know when they might have access to the grid and need some sort of alternative lighting source. Historically, that would have been kerosene lamps. When our products come in, it's plug and play solar home systems. Our products are across rural India, as well as sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of South and Southeast Asia as well. So we're really serving a very specific segment of the market. And it's interesting, you know, I was just thinking back to 2012 as you were describing the journey in the last 8 years as well. And for us and for our consumers, the vast majority of our customers were completely off-grid in 2012 in India. You know, when we started selling our products 11 years ago in India, half of the country was completely off-grid and dependent on kerosene. And so today that's not the case. The majority of our customers are actually now grid connected in India. Not true in the rest of the world, certainly not in Africa where I'm based. But that is one huge change that we've seen in the last decade. And as I look forward to the next decade, I think this will continue to be the profile. I think we've got you know, grid connected customers that want more autonomy over how they access their energy and when they access their energy. At the moment, you know, when you ask what's holding us back, at the moment, right now, this COVID pandemic has, I think, opened up our eyes to a lot of challenges, and there's a lot of very near-term challenges. You know, obviously with the restricted mobility, but also some challenges that we see in the next, I don't know how many quarters or year as we kind of recover from this. And so I think some of the big questions for us is how do we sustain this really important work that we're doing, particularly in our case to serve the lowest income segments of our economy. And maybe I'll just pause there and happy to elaborate more.
Thank you, Radhika. And I'm going to come back to exactly that issue of, you know, how do you deal with depressed demand given the pandemic and economic crisis we are in. But hold your thoughts on that for a second. Let me turn to Ashvin. Ashvin, the Rockefeller Foundation has for many years been pushing many different innovations around building up the markets around distributed energy. So when you reflect back on what's happened and you think ahead of what is likely to come about, what do you think is holding back our imaginations? Your initial thoughts.
Thanks, Arunabha, and thanks to everyone, to the organizers for this. It's great to see everyone. I mean, to your direct question, what's holding back the imagination? I mean, I think there are a lot of people who are trying to reimagine the future of energy, what we mean by a grid, a smart grid, you know, notions of building the grid from the outside in. But you're right in the sense that that has not got mainstreamed enough. I think it is changing. I genuinely believe that we're seeing momentum, and we'll talk later about how is the current crisis, you know, either going to be a decelerator or accelerator of that momentum. But I think momentum is shifting, and if you look at what's happening in Africa today, the level of mainstream financing coming into the off-grid sector, whether it's mini grids or solar home systems or other scales and technologies, is dramatically different from 5 years ago. I mean, if you talk to friends at the IFC who maybe 5 or 6 years ago would be pretty skeptical of this as an investable proposition, are now really at the forefront of thinking about how off-grid and mini grids can be part of the future. But you know, this is a 150-year-old sector. There's a pretty strong incumbent mindset. So when you talk about what's holding back imagination, this is not a sector that's seen a huge amount of disruption and innovation. You know, we built large centralized power plants and sort of extended transmission and distribution lines, and then finally reach the customer. And, you know, when we get to you, we'll get to you kind of thing has been the mindset. Ironically, when we go back to the earliest forms of electrification, it actually did start with distributed energy, albeit with other sources of fuel. I think another challenge on imagination is sort of binary thinking. Like, you either have the grid or you don't have the grid. And so there's always been this sort of thinking about what happens if the grid arrives. And actually, we need to reimagine that question. It's the wrong question. It's not a question of what happens when the grid arrives. It's a question of how do you actually strengthen and make your grid more resilient by having a combination of technologies. How do you combine distributed renewable energy with a functioning or quasi-functioning grid, stabilize the grid, ensure reliability, et cetera, et cetera. And then I think the other thing is that, you know, there are real bottlenecks. There are policy bottlenecks. There are certainly cost and business model bottlenecks, certainly in the mini grid space that we've been most active in. You know, costs have come down. They need to come down further. And so we don't see, if you really operate with cost reflective tariffs in the mini grid sector, you know, you're still way off what highly subsidized grid power can provide. And that's often a political bottleneck that can be difficult to overcome. And I'll say one last thing, and I'm thinking about this a lot today in the context of COVID, is I think we have not done a good enough job at actually building the evidence and demonstrating the fundamental link and centrality of energy consumption to sort of issues of poverty and development, particularly in the context of the 21st century. And when we think about the economy structure today, you know, we firmly believe that we can't end poverty if we don't end energy poverty. And I think that argument it's a nice tagline, but I don't think it's really been backed up by enough evidence and enough data and enough people in ministries of finance and planning believing that. And I would, you know, I've been having a lot of conversations recently with the team at the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Institute, the people who did the multidimensional index on poverty. Of their 10 dimensions of poverty, the one that is the most accurate predictor of multidimensional poverty is lack of electrification. But, you know, it's still seen too much as sort of this sort of infrastructure play and not really something that's fundamental to human well-being. So I think there's a lot of different failures of imagination that we need to be working on.
That's great, Ashvin. I mean, those are, we could spend the next, 2 days working through each of those 4 challenges that you've highlighted: the incumbent mindset, the binary thinking, distorted cost profiles, and then, of course, our inability to think through the linkages between SDG Goal 7 and SDG Goal everything else. But then let me turn to Hendrik first. When you hear these propositions that there is this challenge of the binary, there is a challenge of distorted costs and subsidies, where does financing of distributed energy come in then? I mean, is there a lack of imagination around financing, or is there new imagination around financing happening? Hendrik?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I would say on the financing side also a lot of things have happened. Along the way that I think also you mentioned in the opening remarks, as the sector has started out very much in a clear development space, filling a gap, serving the bottom of the pyramid, and maturing much more into let's say in the solar home system into a consumer space, but also on the bigger system, mini grids, into something that is really something that is not just filling the gap, but as Ashvin also said, is basically fighting out a space, a coexistence with a grid, and this this conflict that was perceived in the beginning is becoming, I think it's becoming solved in many people's minds. So it's not so much anymore just the pure concessional play of trying to finance something that has difficulties to stand on its own commercial feet, but still a high development justification. So a lot of commercial finance and also development bank financing has actually been flushing into the system into the sector over the last decades, which is very positive. It is, and I think that would be picking up this what you mentioned just in the question now to me. This compartmentalized thinking, that you have an energy pocket or an energy program trying to do something for energy for this SDG 3, and then you have another compartment looking at health, looking at education. And I think that's now also the big opportunity of bringing those streams together, where the crisis actually is a catalyzing element of seeing energy also as a key element to improve the resilience of the health sector, of the education sector. I think that's where it comes together. There could always be more imagination on the side of financing. I think we have a toolbox that works by and large. And now to close, I think the big interesting question and challenge is how to link this toolbox to the big influx, hopefully big influx of stimulus money that is coming, and to make sure that this really puts the decentralized energy sector in the place where it belongs, in this build back better and sustainable economic growth context.
That's great. In fact, in my next round, I'm going to come back to you, Hendrik, and Ashvin and Radhika, both of you, because the three of you have highlighted this kind of the urgency of what the pandemic is throwing up in terms of energy access on one side and the economic recovery on the other. And if we could link the two, maybe new opportunities for financing come. But let's save that question for a bit. Let me turn to Jagjeet. You represent, Jagjeet, the International Solar Alliance. It has more than 80 member countries, many of whom have very strong solar potential, many of whom have very poor energy access metrics. Where does international cooperation fit in terms of reimagining or imagining a different future for distributed energy? Jagjeet. Could you unmute yourself, Jagjeet?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Arunabha, for framing the way you're framed, crisis of imagination and COVID crisis, and how we bring this decentralized energy question. So let me start with crisis of imagination and the way we are trying to think a bit out of the box at International Solar Alliance. As you rightly updated, we have more than 80 member countries, primarily LDCs in Africa and island countries in both Caribbean and Pacific. When we look at numbers, which we all know, if we stay on business as usual scenario, about 650 million people would have no access to electricity, primarily in Africa. And if you look at the countries, the problem is more in 12 countries, right. And it's more acute in some more than others. And then you say, okay, where's this market of, off-grid solar going? If you look at GOGLA studies, SMAP studies, and few other market studies, they're growing at about 10%, for last few years. You take their projections, they want to grow about 7 to 8% CAGR for next 10 years, the decade we are talking about, where we need to solve this. Even if you take the high end of the growth, still you would have 250 million people without access to electricity. Yeah, I'm not even going whether of the 400 they will tackle, whether they have tier 3 or tier 4 access to electricity. We are still talking about them getting tier 1, tier 2, one solar line or something else. So we are giving them basic, bare minimum, or rather just to survive, but still you have 250 million people without access to electricity. So the way we started looking at this issue is, it has to be looked at the way, vaccine people looked at advanced market commitments, take it in a way as a social problem and public good, and we need to throw some money at it, but throw money at it in a very intelligent way. So borrowing from the health sector, what our DG thought, let's start aggregation model. And some of you have been working with us. So what we do is we pool demand and we throw international price tenders, global corporates, aggregators, they bid. And we have done one price discovery tender in solar water pumps, and the prices discovered of the 300,000 pumps put on tender are about 30 to 40% lower than the prevailing prices in Africa. So the next tender we are going to go ahead is solar home system for about 47 million households, 5 people in one household that's taking care of 250 over a 4-year period, 4 to 5 year period. And essentially the idea is, let's bring governments in and let them own this demand and let private sector respond to this big demand. And our hope is, having learned some lessons from our water tender or from Gavi, that the prices those would be discovered would be lower than the prevailing price. And what does that do to markets? It creates a big demand to begin with. Our role is to bring governments to work on the taxes. If you look at the price structure of the solar home system, the cost of the product, the real product, is just about 1/3. 1/3 is then taxes, and then the rest is maintenance cost and overheads and this and that. So at Solar Alliance, what we're trying to do is get a commitment from governments that if you work with us on this tender and the prices are discovered pretty low, you're gonna waive off the taxes. And you would procure them in bulk. But the question still remains, would they have the money to buy this? Would they have the large enough subsidies? That's where the partnership you're talking about under the ISA umbrella comes in. So we're engaging with all multilateral and bilateral financial institutions plus donors to say, okay guys, earlier you may have to pump in $10 billion to solve this problem. What now we are offering is just a $5 billion problem. Could you face it for 5 years and start putting 1 billion together? And that's where this problem becomes much more manageable. So that's the kind of imaginative solutions we are trying to work out. Now let me connect it to the COVID crisis and where they both marry. So as people say, crisis is too important to be lost. There is always an opportunity. And I think as Hendrik talked about, in health sector, marrying off-grid solar with health, I think there is a big opportunity. In the bank I come from, World Bank, there is a lot of reprogramming of IDA loans happening to see if in health kind of concessional loan provisions, now we can bring solar solutions. Again, let me throw in some number. 1 in 4 healthcare centers in Africa don't have any access to electricity. Of the health centers which have electricity, only 25% reliable electricity. So what at ISA we are trying to do is put together what we call ISA Cares initiative, essentially to electrify with solar at least 1 primary healthcare center in each district of our membership. And we hope that with this test case, donors would get excited along with multilateral banks, and we may be able to electrify all the primary healthcare centers. Our value would be bulk procurement, bring the price down, get commitments from governments to lower the peripheral things which add up to the price, and bring all kind of players, foundation, multilateral, traditional donors, to treat this as an aid, as a real vaccine kind of a problem, and pump in some grant money with a real value add. Let me pause here.
Thank you, Jagjeet. That really, the solar pumps tender, the new tender, upcoming tender for solar home systems, and now for the community energy for primary health centers, all sound very exciting, because that was very much the proposition of the International Solar Alliance. I've been engaged with it since well before inception. The idea was to aggregate demand and offer a much larger market that was sort of sitting under the noses of the investors, but always getting missed. But let me turn back to you, Radhika. On this panel, apart from you, there is someone representing a philanthropic institution, someone representing an international organization, but also with a background from multilateral development banks. And you have someone from a development bank, a multilateral development bank. Now, as a representative of the private sector, trying to create and build and deepen markets in the distributed energy space, which of these 3 would you turn to in a crisis? And could you tell us a little bit more about how the crisis is affecting you.
Yeah.
And what is your plans to get out of it?
Yeah. Gosh, you're forcing me to choose just one person to turn to. Maybe I'll rephrase it. Who would I go to first? Yeah. I think Hendrik, honestly. I think the development finance institution, really critical right now. So, and I will back that by saying development finance institutions have been really quick to step in and converse with our industry to figure out how to keep us floating across these next few months. And let me explain a little bit more. About half of our business is a pay-as-you-go business. So we sell about half of our solar home systems and portable lamps through a technology-enabled platform that allows our customers to pay for the product in small installments over time, which addresses a lot of the affordability challenges of the consumers that we're trying to reach. The pay-as-you-go business model has really accelerated adoption of distributed energy systems, particularly in East Africa, where mobile money is really prevalent. And in the last, I'd say 3 or 4 years, it's been one of the largest sort of changers in our industry. We're seeing this huge shift of consumers moving from smaller systems to larger systems because they now have financing. And that's tremendous. And that's what I think our industry has been banking on for the continued growth across the next 5 years or 10 years and so on. And in this moment, because of all the challenges with COVID, people can't necessarily make their payments. In some cases, in Nigeria, where mobile money is not prevalent, we actually are dependent on people meeting. Our customers have to meet our agents, or agents have to go to our customers to collect money. And so even if our customers have money to continue paying, there's just a roadblock right there, as there are for countless other industries across the world. And then in markets where customers are paying through mobile money, their income may start to take a huge hit. Luckily, we've not seen a huge hit just yet in Kenya and Uganda, Tanzania. But we are financing huge books of receivables, and we just don't have, our industry, Greenlight included, but I'll speak on behalf of our peers, we don't have the cash flow to sort of float, 3 months or 6 months of huge hits to our receivables, to our collections. And that could just, the worst case scenario, we could just crumble immediately, not because customers don't want to pay, but because they actually physically cannot pay. And so that's where we as an industry actually came together, a bunch of peers, competitors, investors, and started to think about what can we do? And one, I think, beautiful shining light has been how quickly the DFIs, I don't usually say DFIs moving quickly in the same sentence, but how quickly the development finance community has really come together to put this sort of quick interim fund together for the distributed energy sector. And that's been, it's just getting started. Companies are now starting to apply for funding, but that's been tremendously helpful. So I would say, if this sort of crisis comes again, absolutely, this is likely where our industry is going to go first, to quickly put a Band-Aid in place, because we think this is temporary. This is a temporary cash flow challenge. We know people need our products. We think that the demand for our products may even increase as people, kind of come back to some sort of normal. But or a new normal, I should say, but it's really critical that our industry can survive the next X number of months, where sort of cash flow or sort of cash in business as normal is disrupted, or is likely to be pretty disrupted. Yeah, I wouldn't leave the other two of you out. I think then, after this sort of immediate Band-Aid, I think the sort of the need to work more and more with governments is increasingly clear in our industry. And we're seeing more successful examples of this popping up, which 5 years ago, even 2 years ago, didn't really exist in our industry. So so that's where I would go longer term, but near term, I would go DFI.
In fact, let me turn that question to the other three on the panel, because what's missing on the panel is, representation from government. And the reason I say this is that, the kind of crisis or challenge that Radhika is describing is a challenge that any small business is facing, right? It's a crisis of cash flow. You have known demand, you have a customer base, you have a history of delivering reasonably good service, and there is willingness to pay. And because people, as Ashvin was realizing, at least people realize the links between energy and the rest of their developmental options, even if economists always don't make that connect. So when governments are putting out big stimulus packages for the sort of larger sector of micro, small, and medium enterprises, when governments are using the stimulus packages to bail out utilities, power utilities, is there a role for government to more specifically target some attention towards shoring up this particular sector? Not just because you're saving an individual business or giving it a bridge loan, but because of all the other connects it has to development. Any thoughts on that? Any one of you can come in on this.
I'm happy to step in, Arunabha. I mean,
Sure.
Yeah, short answer is absolutely yes. The question is, what's the sort of right sequencing? I mean, to get to the point that Radhika was making, and nimbleness, I'm not sure that's one thing that governments may not be as solid on. And I do think the immediate priority is actually securing the sector in order for it to then have a foundation for future growth. So, you know, the things that are happening with this off-grid debt relief fund that's being driven out of a group in Nairobi, and Acumen and Persistent and others, which we're also involved with. I think the point that Jagjeet was making around really looking at ways to link the sort of energizing health work, because not only is that dealing with the health resilience, it's also providing a channel for off-grid developers and mini-grid developers to deploy assets and kind of continue, you know, sort of moving their supply chains and their operations forward. We're going to have to look at the customer side as well. You know, in India, we operate with about 270 mini-grids with 5 or 6 different companies, and the question is, are these small and micro enterprises that are connected to these mini-grids, are they just in a moment of a cash flow crisis, or are they also going to become lapsed businesses? And therefore, what is the stimulus that's needed for the SME sector in general? And then to what extent can you create a kind of DRE vertical within that, both for the DRE sector, but also for the small businesses that are around them in terms of the ecosystem that supports that either relies on the DRE sector as a source of energy, or is part of the supply chain. So I absolutely think that there's a role for government in recognizing that as a vital sector, because it's an opportunity to rethink distributed economic development, not just distributed energy, right? What is going to drive local job creation? You have tens of millions of migrants returning to rural India, who may not want to immediately go back to the city. They've been through a harrowing experience, and I think people are rethinking you know, what does it mean to be an urban migrant? So there's going to be a massive need for jobs and livelihood generation in rural India. And I think putting the DRE sector sort of at the heart of that in terms of the kind of construction, installation activities that can be generated. And it's such a valuable proposition, because while it can help you overcome the immediate livelihoods crisis, and jobs crisis and cash flow crisis, it's also addressing all of those medium and long-term issues that we care deeply about. It's also addressing the question of moving to a smarter grid, a more resilient grid, you know, providing more reliable energy, and ultimately also linking you into the questions around climate change and, you know, what's the future energy mix you want, because the low energy customers of today are going to be the high energy customers of the future. So we are absolutely of the belief and conviction that as long as the DRE sector can be secured and can be stabilized, and we don't start seeing companies failing, that this needs to be positioned with governments and with DFIs and with donors as a major opportunity in terms of an economic recovery, an inclusive economic recovery.
In fact, you've stolen the question that I was going to ask you next about the links between distributed energy provision and the opportunity to shore up or create entirely new businesses, not just on the supply side, but on the demand side, the MSMEs in the rural economy. I mean, even if 10% of India's migrant labor did not go back to the city, right? We're talking about maybe 30 million more people looking for gainful employment in the villages or having to create their own enterprises. One of the things we have done at CW is kicked off a program called Powering Livelihoods to try and help these companies that have already got proven technologies. They've crossed the technological valley of death, but need that enough scale to get through the commercial valley of death before they attract regular financing from banks, especially when they're servicing the rural economy. But when you create those income generating activities, there's even more willingness to pay because there's an even more direct connect between the energy access on one hand and the ability to get more income into the household. So therefore, let me now turn to Hendrik and Jagjeet again. Let's look a little bit beyond the crisis. I liked Radhika's kind of optimism that this is a short-term cash flow problem. This is something that might last for 5 or 6 months. Let's take it as 2 or 3 quarters, right? But there is a world beyond that. And where do you think distributed energy is going to go in that world? One of the questions that has come up from one of the listeners, very interesting, that as households get electrified, the really interesting dynamic will be the uptick in overall energy demand. It's kind of, you taste blood once and then you want more of it, which is why even metrics of energy access, Jagjeet, you were referring to tier 1, tier 2, that's exactly the point, that it's a dynamic, it's an evolving metric of what energy access really means between today and what it will mean 10 years from now. So when that second wave, when a third wave of rising energy demand comes, what is the potential for distributed energy to fill that demand? The questioner specifically asks, the use of Internet of Things and new technology. If distributed energy can tap into that next surge of demand, then it can truly become sustainable. Do you think that's possible, or do you think it will still compete on the margins? Who wants to go first? Hendrik? Jagjeet, go ahead.
Yeah, let me try to respond to the points you raised earlier and this point. So in terms of the membership we have, which are more LDCs in Africa and SIDS, there is no economic stimulus coming. So one could forget about reviving their SMEs, or whatever is lost, you save your life if you can, kind of a scenario. That's where I think the DFIs and bilateral financial institutions, which are trying to reprogram now, and I think that become very important. So what we've been trying to do with SG's office, their new envoy on climate, with SC for All and others, to drumbeat that in all the restructuring or new money that would be pumped in now, we should also think about this issue more centrally in terms of energy, while marrying it with health, but beyond as well, so that these things have a hope to survive and then move forward. So that's point one, and we need to look at these external public flows for LDCs and SIDS more carefully and see if that could be the stimulus which could take us over the hump and then expand the distributed. I'm talking about more solar here. Sure. The second question related point is the whole refugee or FCV countries, the conflict prone or refugee areas, and where Corona is about to hit and people are worried about big panic and mass casualties in Syria, in parts of Africa. And there, I think the opportunity again is to work with the existing humanitarian assistance agencies, UNHCR and others, to see how best we could promote these decentralized energy solutions now, where again, there's a lot of donor interest is there, donor money is coming around, to take care of those segments of populations in FCV countries. In fact, we are trying to work out some analytics with EIB and later maybe a lending towards these FCV segments. And that's another pocket where we need to look very carefully in the whole COVID world. Then as we go post-COVID, I would say, again, you know, our perspective on this is that, you know, we need to get governments going in this in a big way. They need to prioritize these. They need to come clearly with, you know, their mini-grid policies, off-grid support incentives. Unless that happens, you know, private sector efforts, no matter how great they are and essential they are, would not really solve the problem. So I think we need to somehow get this compact again back, where governments and private sector agree on a set of reforms they need to do. You know, climate change somehow ends up as energy transition agenda in major economies, and energy access becomes a, you know, a stepchild in that debate. And we need to bring it. See, what our effort has been bring SDG 13 and 7 together in climate debate. You know, it shouldn't happen that SDG 7 becomes a second child, and, you know, you only look at it from, you know, broader poverty reduction imperatives, but not as climate. So I think for long term, we need to bring that together, and maybe COP26 in K gives us that opportunity to bring it again together and drumbeat about it. UN has broadly taken energy access as a theme for the year. So there are various opportunities where we see to move governments in a big consortium with private sector foundations and others. Let me pause here for now.
Sure. Hendrik, the opportunities with future technologies to tap into the new demand?
Yes, and I think that's actually yeah, a very intriguing aspect, because and it also hits a bit the heart of the challenge that the mini grids, of course, we don't finance mini grids, let's say, with the full aspiration of only powering a few lights, maybe an egg incubator and these kind of things. The full value will unfold when productive use really picks up, which is the big challenge of most of the mini grid operators, to set up already a big part of the infrastructure first, hoping and working towards a future with a lot more demand, productive use. And that's also where there is a role for development finance and also donors to take part of this risk and to bridge this very difficult journey where you pick your side, you make your bet basically. Few mini grids, many mini grids hopefully will thrive, others will not make it. And the target picture is, of course, and I think there's with new technology developing, and also with from the experience of mini grids that are working very well at the moment, that it is very much possible to develop, let's say, a grid that starts out in a very rudimentary basis into something that, as development kicks in the setting of the mini grid, can serve much higher loads, can also be instrumental in enabling this kind of economic development. So, I mean, yeah, looking beyond the crisis, I think that's the big challenge, especially for the mini grid part, to as far as banks and also donors are concerned, to basically provide the kind of products that can absorb some of the risk in their journey, and also to help those mini grid operators and developers that really holistically tackle this challenge beyond the technical difficulties of basically embrace the challenge of cultivating sustainable energy demand. Pause here.
So now, let me go a little bit in reverse order and come back to you again, Hendrik. If I saw a lot of head nodding around this notion of the DFI's role to try and de-risk some of these investments or provide some of the backing. And we in principle, we all seem to agree with that, because the belief is that that role of public money or DFI money can help to crowd in a lot of private investment. The question is, in reality, what is, I mean, Jagjeet made a very important point about, the need for policies, specific policies around distributed energy, etc. What else will have to go into this recipe that that will require the DFIs coming up with the guarantees or the backstop? Maybe there's a policy. Maybe, of course, companies like Greenlight Planet need to be, of course, available on the ground. But demand will keep surging. So unless we are able to serve that demand, and rapidly so, it'll get served by somebody else. So describe to us the recipe that will help us scale this up faster.
Yeah. Well, just to offer a few thoughts, not to take too much time on this, as I know that the other panelists will have much to offer there as well. I think, as Ashvin mentioned before, I mean, there is still a big viability challenge in many of the settings. So based on current demand, based on current technology, it's very difficult to get to cost-reflective tariffs below $1, or even that would be very difficult. So it's hugely expensive still, especially at the outset, if you look at micro picogrids. So there is a need or an opportunity also to structure at a higher level, not just from one pilot to the next one, but at an aggregate level, at a country level programs, concession type or whatever it is, that allows to bring in private financing, maybe DFI, also grants, in a way that buy down the cost a bit and allow to offer a tariff to end consumers that is halfway affordable. So that would be, I think, the first phase to in the recipe, to move a bit from a pilot here, pilot there, into something that's bigger, to mobilize bigger amounts, and to also allow for a certain degree of standardization that can be found with some mini-grid operators already, but which is really critical to bring down the cost. And then the other part, the big part, is to tap into the dormant demand and the demand that can be developed. I don't think that anybody else would necessarily serve it. It's really the challenge of the decentralized utility to be instrumental in developing that. Big partnerships are needed with other organizations. Health and education is often mentioned, local industries. It's a difficult recipe, unfortunately, but yeah, let me pause here.
Ashvin, let me jump to you before I come back to Jagjeet and Radhika. As a philanthropic organization, you have the ability to just bet on new ideas, which, if they gain scale or, demonstrate sufficient proof of concept, can evolve into something commercial. So you mentioned the role of MSMEs and the linkage to energy supply earlier. Jagjeet mentioned the role of advanced market commitments to aggregate demand. And so in that imagination of how to scale this up, are there some new ideas that you're piloting or thinking about? You're kind of a venture capitalist for ideas. So what other ideas are you considering?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these ideas are things that people have been mentioning. I don't think any one organization is going to sort of lead the charge. I mean, I think at the end of the day, there are 3 or 4 things that we're working on, but very much in partnership with others. The first is the whole idea of integrated electrification and energy planning, right? The idea, and this speaks to the question of regulations and a belief at the highest level that we can do this quicker, cheaper, and more impactfully if national governments and other energy investors and planners actually look at the best fit and the best combination of technologies. It's not a competition between grid, mini grid, and off grid. It's that integration. So at the very highest level, just working on that, and we put together a global commission on ending energy poverty last year that was sort of really at the center of it, is this notion of how do you really get integrated distribution frameworks in which off grid and mini grids play the part that they should be if you look at all of the data, right? If you look at all the reports, SMAP comes out with a report and says 490 million people should be electrified by off-grid and mini-grid solutions. Great. So how do we move from desktop to the field in terms of unlocking that reality? And part of it is that. The second thing, which hasn't come up a lot today, is the role of sort of further technology innovation. I think we've all ridden a positive wave in terms of some of the big technology prices that have come down, whether it's PV or batteries, storage, etc. But for the mini grid sector in particular, there's still a lot more to be done in terms of optimization, advanced market commitments. So it's not pure R&D, but a lot of these technologies are not being developed with the off-grid sector in mind. And the question is, how do you then adapt and apply them? And can you then link that to larger procurements? The great example of the power of scale when we were entering into this partnership with Tata Power in India, when they decided to really get into off-grid and mini-grid electrification at large scale, when we were doing the financial modeling, all they had to do was make a phone call to a supplier and say, if we ordered 2,000 of these, what price would we get? Boom, right. We suddenly saw a 1% uptick in the IRR. And I know those are just paper exercises, but it's about leadership as well and a willingness to kind of step up and kind of make the market. On finance, I just say we are big believers that the viability gap is there. It needs to be filled. SE for All and Damilola and her team are sort of leading the charge on this notion of a universal energy or electrification fund. Many of the private players who are at the forefront of understanding the gaps, folks like PowerGen in Africa and others, Cross Boundary, all these guys, they understand that for their businesses to thrive, they're going to need, anywhere between 20 to 40% concessional subsidy capital. And how do we won't get that if we don't get that overall integrated thinking adopted. And then there is the demand piece. Well, one of the exciting things that's happening with players like the World Bank, is they are really now starting to try and operationalize notions of livelihood and energy nexus, ag energy nexus. We've been hearing these terms for a long time, but how do you actually converge investments? So we're partnering with the World Bank on a couple of efforts in Africa around this to really bring the agriculture and energy planning together. And in fact, the off-grid electrification in Ethiopia, I think, will be driven by the ag sector and by the leadership being shown by the Agricultural Transformation Agency there, rather than by the Ministry of Energy on its own. So, this is beginning to move. We're moving to a world in which integrated rural development, which we used to talk about in the 70s, is actually being enabled today by the kinds of technologies and data that we have at our disposal, whereas in the past it was just rhetoric.
Great. We have just about 6-7 minutes left. So let me turn back to you, Radhika and Jagjeet. Reflecting on the same question, I mean, you've heard on the financial innovation side, policy innovation side, and tech innovation side. What does that mean for you as a business? How much time do you even have to innovate on the product or the service that you're offering versus scaling up what you have? And equally, Jagjeet, when you're looking at these really small countries, not so much fiscal room, and you are trying to aggregate demand, you're aggregating demand for the very basic energy solutions right now. Is there a way to get them to even think about the potentially bright future for applying new technologies and scaling up operations on the productive energy side? Maybe Radhika first and then Jagjeet.
Sure. One thing that was in my mind is in the last few minutes was, do we really need a lot of innovation in financing to scale? When I think about the harder to reach segments and markets, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, there's, think about DRC, Mozambique, West Africa, Francophone West Africa, a lot of the underpenetrated markets where the really successful models from Kenya, from Uganda, Tanzania, a few other markets in the world have not yet proliferated and are not, at this pace of just sort of like coasting acceleration like we see in Kenya. What's stopping that? And there's a number of things stopping that. I think the nascency of the industry, the lack of consumer awareness, but some of it is just the sheer challenge to scale in vastly different markets than some of the easier to start in countries. And the other reality is when companies like ours get to a certain stage where things are working, you know, we're far past those early startup years, proof of concept. One of our biggest battles is making sure we're financially sustainable. We are financially sustainable, but the decisions that we make about where do we step next and scale next, that financial sustainability factors significantly into those decisions, largely because of the pressure that we have from our investors or debt investors, for example, right? We become less investable if we take some big risks that prove to be far more challenging than we had anticipated. And I think that's the reality when we think about that under-addressed or unaddressed market. And Jagjeet, you rightly pointed out that if we go at this status quo, there's hundreds of millions of people. 250 million, I think, is really generous. Actually, it's probably much larger, that are just not going to see our solutions. And these are real business challenges. It's not that easy for us to jump. And so coming back to that, my sort of plea for, let's not try to get too sexy in the financial model, you know, the financial side of, let's recognize that some places are just really difficult. And we're going to need a lot of de-risking agents to pull us into some of these harder to serve markets. And that's, you know, it can be a combination of things, but just that upfront, we think this could work, we feel pretty confident, but you know, if things don't work, what is the risk to our core business? If that equation doesn't balance out, we're unlikely to go there. And that's true of, you know, any of our competitors, of our peers in this sector. So I think that's one, you know, request I'd say back to the DFI world is, let's just take what works and acknowledge what, you know, the areas that are more challenging and just, let's not get too complicated about how we, you know, think about scaling. I think there's certainly a time and place for creative, you know, innovative financing, but I think the real scale, we actually probably just need some really easy answers there. Yeah.
So Jagjeet, you know, last word to you. We got maybe a couple of minutes. So Radhika is saying, let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's still a lot of energy poor people who need some basic solutions, and let's just make sure there's the financing and the demand aggregation that helps to deliver that bare minimum. What's your thought? Is the International Solar Alliance trying to deliver at that end, or trying to scale up innovations at a different end of the spectrum?
I couldn't agree more with her. The problem is huge. We need to address both financial and non-financial barriers. Just to kind of summarize, we'll make 3 quick points. So, you know, as Ashvin was saying, we're doing that approach. Link it with sectors. So we have this, you know, scaling solar in agriculture programs, you know, solarizing the whole pump set. Second is solarizing the cold chains. Third is solarizing health. So if you start taking this kind of more horizontal approaches, you tee up yourselves with the right line ministries who actually have to take this forward, and that makes it much more interesting and sustainable. So that's point number 1. The second is the capacity of these institutions, the governments, the ministries, you know, their implementing entity to actually take it forward. So at ISA, what we are trying to do is we've started at all ends of it. You know, we have now master's program for mid-career government professionals from our member countries. One is an MBA program, second is an MTech. We are starting an undergrad program, solar technologies, right. And you know, modifying Indian Surya Mitra experience and training those private sector and entrepreneurs and technicians in big scale, and then also training master trainers. So at the scale we are going, if we multiply by 5 and take it to next 5 years, I think we would have trained like 15,000 people who are actually going to make a difference in these markets and make them scaled up and sustainable. And third point, which is...
Sorry, Jagjeet, I know you have a third point, but the organizers are telling me to wrap up because they've got to get the next panel in, but you are still ending on a pretty strong note. And I think what we've basically heard is there's a lot to do in terms of filling the energy gap that's still there, but there's also a lot of this innovation happening in philanthropic foundations, in international organizations, and in the development finance institutions. So as long as we all kept coming together, in real life or virtually, I think there's a lot to achieve. Thank you so much for all of you who listened in, and thank you to the panelists for a great conversation.